just going to ask you straight away, because Jeff left us with the key question that we're trying to ask here, or the key question that we're trying to answer here, which is around how do we mainstream this stuff? How do we get more people to notice it? And when we were having a conversation beforehand, we realized that actually story and narrative comes into this in terms of selling and how we talk about this work. And so Ella, Filiz, and Millie all work in different sectors, different fields, different cultures, different countries, but they have something that brings them together, and that's the challenge of communicating this stuff in big institutions. So Ella, why don't we go straight to you, and you tell us what stories, narratives, systems change looks like in the work that you do.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for hosting us. So I work in the UK, and I spent the first part of my career working in international development overseas, and came back from that experience convinced of two things: of the importance of working systemically and of the importance of working with culture. And I'm someone who's always had these two strands to my work. So I work as a screenwriter for film and TV, and I work in the field of systems innovation and have co-founded two organizations, The Point People, which works on systems innovation across sectors, and the Comms Lab, which particularly focuses on the advertising industry and how we can support systemic transformation within advertising so that it works better for people and the planet. And so there is this saying about story, that story is to human like water is to fish. So it is the thing that surrounds us that is invisible to us. We cannot see the stories that rule our lives, and they are so powerful. And just as water is essential for the survival of fish, so it would seem that story is essential for the survival of human civilization. We would not be able to live together in large groups without the existence of story. It is the most kind of potent and ancient of technologies. And, you know, it does all these different things. So it enables us to cohere into communities. It enables us to create meaning out of patterns. It enables us to communicate values and norms across generations. And it enables us to access the emotional part of our brains, which is really where we make most of our decisions. And yet, in the world of innovation, story has a very kind of soft, fuzzy association. It's like you do the real work of innovation, and then you tell some nice stories about it afterwards. And I feel that as a community, we are really missing a trick when it comes to working with narrative. Because like whatever issue you are working on, whether that is girls in science, whether that is international development, whether that is the finance sector, every single person you speak to will already have a story, possibly like multiple and contradictory stories about the issue that you are working on. You are never going to be creating an intervention on a blank slate. Instead, you are going to be wading into a seething mess of stories. And if we don't start to understand how to work with narrative, it will work against us. Because what narrative and culture is, it's the soil into which all of your innovation interventions are going to be planted. It is the operating system. If we want to mainstream social innovation, we have to start working with culture more. And so that's where my work is focused right now. So I'm working with donors and philanthropists to help them understand how you work with narrative, with CSOs to build their capacity, but then also kind of messing around in this space of popular culture. So really, to the earlier discussions, really looking at how do we work with popular culture, not just about communicating innovation, but actually about how do we work on a level of values, because that's what story does. Story is how we understand values. And so if we want to have more value in terms of impact, we have to work at the level of values. And that means, I think, we have to take narrative and story into the core of what we do and not see it as a kind of nice, fuzzy add-on that we do at the end of the real work.
Thank you, Ella. What a great way to get this conversation started. And I will ask you as well to think of the next 2 sessions, the next 2 conversations as basically the same conversation. Because actually, incorrectly, this is the hardware of social innovation. So we've named the next session slightly incorrectly because this is the real stuff, right? Thanks, Ella, for kicking us off. We'll come back to you in a second. But Filiz, why don't you just give your perspective on this?
So, almost good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and for me, stories are about agency. Agency is the degree to which a person believes they can change their life. And what we want to try to do in all of our different roles in the social sector is always about empowerment and trying to increase that agency. When you increase someone's feeling about their own power to change their lives, you increase their perceptions about the power they have to change other lives and the world around them. And I think stories are about agency. I love what you said about this space and the psychological aspect of stories, and picking up from there. I think throughout my work, and I can divide that up into kind of 3 major headings. The first part of my life after the organizational psychology and management consulting bit was just to prepare me, I guess, for everything I would do after. I worked a lot with 3 groups. One was the government, to convince them that we needed more enabling environment for NGOs, and we worked a lot with TÜSEV on changing the associations law in Turkey. And that was about agency, about really creating a space where other people could believe that they could make a difference, but in creating an environment in which organizations could operate. The second was working with the Sabancı Foundation and bringing grant making to a foundation in Turkey, which is a new practice for Turkish foundations. And that was about encouraging foundations with wealth to share that wealth with community groups and other NGOs that don't necessarily have access to that, and then sharing those stories to encourage others to inspire change at the local level. And the third is what I'm doing at the present, which is the founding director of something called Esas Sosyal. It's the social investment arm of the Sabancı family, Ali Sabancı, Emine Sabancı Kamışlı, and their family. And what we're obsessed with right now is youth unemployment and the fact that we have almost 30% of young people graduating university and not finding work for at least a year for a number of different reasons. And there it's about telling stories to encourage their agency about hope and the fact that if others can do it, they can do it too, and making the marketplace a bit more sensitive to their needs. So I think that in that sense, stories, they're not underrated, but I don't know that they're necessarily very well curated. And so that would be my point, my takeaway for this first bit of the conversation is we're maybe overemphasizing stories without emphasizing enough the importance of curation. And I think organizations like TED have been really critical, and now everyone is asked for a TED-like talk, which I think is really important, because it's helping us shape and curate. So yes, narrative is important, finding that person, encouraging agency, but I think curation is where we need to focus on.
Thanks, Filiz. Those are some great opening points that lead really well onto the conversations that we've been having off stage. And particularly with Millie, talking about curation of stories, but also kind of legitimacy and getting buy-in. And so, Millie, why don't you tell us a little bit about how this feels from your angle?
Sure. So I work for UNDP. How many people know UNDP? Wow, that's pretty impressive. That doesn't happen that often in outfits that I talk to. So innovation agenda is fairly young in UNDP. It's about 7 years old. And when we set it up, we looked at what others have done in hope to learn from those who are smarter than us. And what we realized is that a lot of the development organizations really centralize their innovation work in headquarters or regional hubs. And to us, that felt rather wrong, because the innovation was set up to help the organization and the governments deal with uncertainty. And you can't really manage uncertainty, right? There is no box or taxonomy in which we can put some of the things that the world is dealing with, the AI, the blockchain, all of these things that we're having to deal with. So we made a decision to put innovation work close to the field, because we thought the only way to engage with uncertainty is through stories. And those stories come from people who are closest to the problem and closest to the field, and those stories, as Ella said, were, for all intents and purposes, invisible to our own organization, and we needed them to percolate up so they can inform the way that we work with innovation. And this really came from a very selfish reason. We, as the organization, are being asked from the governments to answer questions that we've never been asked to deal with before. What is the future of human rights in light of biohacking, for example? We don't have an expert on that. The best that we can do is try to identify people who are dealing with those issues today, and the way to engage with them is through stories that we can start curating and start making sense of. So this is a little bit about what I do. The question that you've asked in terms of legitimacy and stories, so our take on this is, with the governments, is that this is the question of credibility. We find that governments are in love with statistics. They're in love with traditional type of data. And that's not bad, right? So there's a great book by a guy named James Scott that says Seeing Like a State, that calls this a legitimacy issue. It's literally a legibility issue. Governments cannot read what happens on the field. And because stories cannot fit into the taxonomy that statistical office does, somebody needs to come in and, again, be able to curate and create that interface, or as we talked about, a Google Translate for some of those stories. And this is where a lot of the interesting work that we do comes into play.
Thanks, Millie. So let's go to this legibility thing. Bit of a difficult word, but basically, how are we making ourselves clearer? How are we helping to convince and make the change and communicate this to people who it's not necessarily their first language of talking in this way. They don't usually work in this way. Maybe we'll go back to Filiz and you talk about this maybe with the foundations work that you're doing. Like how are you convincing people, and how are you, I guess, practically making that change to happen? We agree it's a good thing. How do you do it?
Right. Examples.
Yeah.
I happened to take a look at this fantastic article that Ella wrote in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. I highly recommend. I counted 29 examples.
Yeah.
There might have been more. I think this is my issue, and I'm just a bit provocative perhaps to say in front of an audience of social innovators, but I don't think being creative and innovative should prevent you from being specific. I think oftentimes we think like, oh, don't limit, you know, this is about the big white space. And great, white space can be white space, we can explore, but we need to be specific because let's be honest, very few people understand what we're talking about most of the time. My mother, my friends are like, you know what, we don't really understand what you do, but we know it's good for the world, so that's just fine. But I've been doing it for almost 20 years, you know, if they still don't understand what I'm doing, that's not a good sign. So this issue about legibility, I think I would call, in my sort of obsession, it's specificity. And I've been really lucky to work with people like Güler Sabancı, the head of the Sabancı Foundation, Emine Sabancı-Kamışlı, and Ali Sabancı, who are, you know, the founders of the social initiative under Esas. They're business people, they're investors, and they want me to be specific. And they have really taught me the value of that. So in trying to convince foundations, corporates, business leaders, people with net worth that is high, tend to be people who are quite active in the business world. They want examples, they want specificity, they want an article like Ella's that lists, this is what I'm talking about, and this is where you can go to see what I mean by that. And I think that's my point, examples and specificity.
Thanks, Filiz. So Ella, why don't you, and for those of you who don't know how to access Ella's article, it's on the 6 Wayfinder website.
I'll tweet it.
And Millie is about to tweet it. Highly recommend reading it. Sorry, we're leaving you with a huge reading list, but I put Ella's up there first. Ella, tell us a little bit about the examples that you talk about.
Yeah.
And also, could you also move into the kind of how? Because the stuff that you're doing with the Comms Lab, I think is just fascinating in terms of really making those changes.
Yeah. So I guess at a very simple level, when we want to work with narrative, it's essentially like a co-design process. And we forget, I think, that narrative is a technology, and so we treat it differently. But you know, as you would with any kind of design-led process, the first thing you need to do is listen. You need to understand the narratives that are already there. That listening can simply be like qualitative interviews with a small group of people, or it can be like, you know, nationwide research, framing research into how an issue is perceived by the public. Then you need to author, preferably co-author, your new narratives. You definitely need to test those narratives with the audiences you're working with, and then you can start to pollinate them across the environment that you're working in, as much as possible working with popular culture. So that's the theory, but obviously the practice often doesn't look like that. And I know that when I first started with the Comms Lab, which is this organization that has very radical intent for the advertising industry, I did not take that advice. And so we did not listen, we did not co-author, we kind of like rolled into the industry with our story that we thought was just so morally compelling that everyone was going to listen. And of course, they didn't listen because we hadn't listened to them. And so after a while, we realized this wasn't working. And then we were like, okay, we have to listen. And so then we started working with researchers, and we did a big kind of research period. Then we had co-authored a new narrative, which completely put our work into the context and the incentives and the worldview of the people we are seeking to influence. And now, you know, we tell that story in many different ways. And so I think, you know, it's easy to sit on a stage and talk about this work, and in practice it isn't easy. It's messy. You know, you're working with narratives is messy, which I think is why lots of people try and avoid it. And so, but what we're seeing with the advertising industry is that, I guess it's a point that someone made earlier on, that making small tweaks in how you define the purpose of a system can have a huge impact. And one way that you can make a small tweak is by telling different stories about the purpose of that system. If you want to really have transformative systemic change, like work on the level of the values and goals of that system. And that's what story does brilliantly.
Thank you, Ella. It's so interesting that, you know, all the work that we do as well with Six is when we're working across sectors all the time. And so not only do we have to be really conscious of this, we have to change it according to who we're talking to. Because this idea of listening, I think, is something that we're generally not very good at. And we assume the other people are just not listening to us. But actually, we're not listening to them. If they're not understanding, it's our fault, not theirs. Millie, how do you do this then in a government situation? How do you Google Translate?
Google Translate. So one of the things that really stuck out, you mentioned the agency. So what we find from stories is those people who are best equipped with insights and assets to solve a problem don't really have the agency to do so. And we find that being able to put together a good story can help provide that agency. And that story, in our case, comes from a number of different sources, and I'll give you just one example. In Albania, we've been advocating quite a bit about investment in sustainable tourism. Under the context that sustainable tourism pays better overall, planet, people, profit, all of it.